watching the Ken Burns documentary, but I was really interested that he picked up that story in the documentary. It's about prominent Philadelphia Quakers who were exiled to Virginia for their refusal to support the war for independence. And although it's not directly a local, issue, it does reflect on how our local Quakers, some of our local Quakers, were mistreated at the hands of the militia in particular. So today, I am delighted to introduce our featured speakers, Bruce Mowday and our facilitator, Mark Bowden. And Bruce is an award-winning author and newspaper reporter. He's authored more than 25 books on history, sports, business, and true crime. I thought all of them were true crime. Most of them with an eye for our very own Chester County. He's a consulting producer with Lionsgate Blackfin Productions in connection with the documentary on his book Killer at the Door, which you all know is about our favorite escaped murderer. And he was just awarded, my goodness, I hope he's going to talk about this, the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution's 1776 to 2026 DAR American 250th Commendation. So congratulations.
Thank you.
So guiding the conversation is Kenneth's own Mark Bowden, journalist and author, best known for his book and the subsequent movie Black Hawk Down. I don't know if that's true. There's others. There's other variants. He's authored 14 other books and continues to write primarily for the Atlantic magazine. But I want to tell you all, we are very fortunate. Mark actually is a volunteer at the Kenneth Heritage Center, and he helps us develop these speaker programs. And so this one actually evolved because we were having a meeting one day, and we were talking about Bruce Mowday and all these topics that he writes about, primarily about Chester County. And Mark said, or one of us said, I'd love to know, what those are all about. And then we all looked at Mark and said, you want to ask him? So without further ado, I'm going to give you Bruce Mowday and Mark Bowden as they talk history.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for such a nice turnout for this event.
It's a big turnout. Thanks everybody for showing up and listening to us.
So, Bruce and I have had somewhat similar career paths. We both were in the newspaper business for a long time. Bruce became an editor, and I just drifted further and further away from the Philadelphia Inquirer, but then went into writing magazine articles and books primarily. The difference is, though, that for me, with just several exceptions, my work has been directed outward, all over the world, really. Whereas Bruce grew up here. Nearly all of his books are rooted right here in Chester County. I often wonder, Bruce, as I'm driving along Route 1 and I see the Brandywine battlefield signs, if when you go by you see redcoats rising up over the hills. I mean, as well informed as you are and as steeped as you are in this area, how has that affected the way you see the landscape around you and the places that you go?
I tell you, Mark, and I've just followed kind of Mark's career as newspaper and magazine, so I've been following Mark here, but that's a great question, and I tell people, if you can go to the Brandywine battlefield, I've done books on Gettysburg, and if you can sit or stand and just block out the rest of the world, if you know a little bit about it, it really starts coming alive. Also, I do a lot of talk with kids at times, and we talk about history and how they can get involved. I said, go back, find somebody in your family, somebody you can latch on to. And once you can do that, that feeling really, really comes about. And when I go to Long Route 1 and I'll go over to Sandy Hollow or the Birmingham Hill at the Birmingham Meeting House, I can envision. And when I did the book on Lafayette, I did the research, consulted what he wrote and everybody else, kind of know the area, it's preserved now on Birmingham Hill, about where he was wounded. Of course, I get people come up and say which way to get grass his blood on, but can't get that. But it means so much if you can put yourself there and think about it, and the more you know, you can visualize it. It just makes so much more for me.
Yeah. And in your advice to young people about finding a connection corresponds, I guess, with your own experience. I read that you first became interested in writing and newspaper work when your grandmother gave you clippings of stories that, was it a great-great-grandfather had written about the Civil War?
You must have read something I wrote, yes. That's exactly true. I know where my career actually started on history and newspapers and writing. I was about 12 years old, and my grandmother brought out these single sheets of original newspaper articles from the New York Mercury. And they were all signed SGC for Samuel George Collins, and that was relative to my grandmother. And that really started it. I went to the National Archives and I got his war records and traced, he was a member of the 61st New York. His brother was wounded at Gettysburg and later died the next year at the Battle of the Wilderness. But that really gave me a grounding and sort on history and people and involvement and personal family and everything. It was so much that I had, when my publisher said, write a book on Gettysburg, I said, no way, there's 30,000 volumes on Gettysburg, nobody needs another book on Gettysburg. I now have 4 books on Gettysburg. And it was kind of telling me to write them, and I was one day at the end of the Scourge, and I looked out at that field, if you've ever been there, and it's like a mile long. And I said, well, I know I had to try it, and Longstreet didn't want to do it, and the 12,000 Confederates came out of that woods. But then I said, I just turned to my left, and I said, who were they? Who were the Union troops that basically saved the nation that day? And I didn't know that much about them, and every other book on Pick the Scourge is written from the Southern perspective. So these guys were actually telling me, we need a book, and it was much deserved. And with my books, that's pretty much how I do it. The books almost tell me what to do.
Huh. Now, I know, from my years working for newspapers that that kind of work is fun and challenging and all-consuming. I think, if you write for a daily newspaper, so you get a jolt of adrenaline every day following stories that will appear in the paper the next day. Very few, actually, of the people that I've worked with in journalism had ambition beyond working for the newspaper, writing for the newspaper, editing the paper. You became managing editor of the daily local news here. So I wonder, I know what the answer is for myself, but for you, how did you evolve from someone working in that daily newsroom atmosphere into working on long projects that take, in some cases, years to research and writing book-length things?
I wish they would only take a year or two. Some guys, take 4 or 5 years kind of research. And you're right, you get that daily jolt, from newspaper articles and writing the newspapers. And if you don't get that jolt, the editor will give you a jolt story and make the deadline. So there's also that. And it's great training for what I thought, for doing the research for the articles and going in. When we were young, or at least I was, I had a goal. I wanted to write. I wanted to write for a newspaper. I wanted to get a magazine piece and a cover story. And I actually did in New York for a military magazine on one of the history pages. And my third one was a book. And I was lucky enough when I just turned 50 to get my first book, and that kind of one book led to the other. And as you know, if you get one successful, usually you get a second one, and the first one is difficult. And my first book was on Fort Delaware in the Civil War. I went down to Fort Delaware. It's a great place to go in the summer. You take a boat ride from Delaware City and you go out to the little island, Pea Patch Island. And I was out there and I said, what an interesting place this was. You know, a little bit, being a newspaper reporter, things, you got a question on what's there and what hasn't been written. I said, what happened here? And they were in the middle of those refurbishing, but all that was written was some reprints of magazine and newspaper stories. And that really sparked my first interest. And I said, this is a book. And luckily, a friend of mine I didn't realize was a historical interpreter there. And he hadn't done a book. And so we did our first book together. So I always had that as another goal, that you do the newspaper and magazines, and I also had a couple radio shows in there, and then finally the book. So, it was always that driving, and people look at my books, because as Karen mentioned, I have a lot of different genres, but if you tie them all together, it's usually the people in there that really kind of excite me, or that drive, why did they do it, whether it's good or bad. So I read about what I like, what interests me, and I remember being in the newspaper. If you couldn't tell your editor a story idea, if you're not invested in it, usually you don't get to write it. And the books and the articles are always better if you really have that drive and interest in doing it.
Yeah. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I always felt when I was doing a lot of writing for the newspaper that the stories that I wrote were most of the time just scratching the surface. I always felt like something more interesting happened here. If I had more time, if I had more space, I would really like to understand exactly, how and why this happened. Of course, books give you that opportunity. You have time. You can write at length. Was that a motivator for you? Did you feel the same way?
Absolutely. Some of those newspaper articles, you're going around, you have that deadline kind of looming, you had to get it in, you couldn't make the presses run late because the advertisers screamed at you because you didn't get things out. So you always had that limitation. I think it honed the skills on getting it as much as you can and getting it accurately, and that helped with doing the research on the books. But you're right, and looking back at it, if I had a little bit more chance, I could go a little bit more in the background of the individuals or the organizations, and it could always be more complete. And of course, space limitations on the newspaper. You only had so many, inches to do a story. So yeah, it was always, it's that first draft of history, I guess. The room ideas on newspaper articles that you get it, you get it started, and you do what you can. But even with books, if you got a publisher out there and they want a deadline to get it out, you can make your production schedule. Sometimes you're even pushed there, you don't have forever to write it. You got to get it done and get it in and work with the publisher also.
Yeah. I know I drove my editors crazy because I always wanted more space and more time. And I would go down and lobby with the guys laying out the paper and say, if we could debunk this story over here, could I add another column and I could write a little bit more?
I would story now where it's not worth anything, just take it out.
Exactly. That headline doesn't need to be that big right there. My friend Richard Van Kramer, who left the Inquirer and was writing for magazines, he would actually get the layout people to make the type smaller on the jump so that he didn't have to cut that much from the story. And, so those of us who have that itch, I think books are where you need to end up. Although when I did turn in a 100,000 page manuscript, my publisher blanched and told me, I don't think a 2,000 page book is what we're looking for here.
I remember I did a high school around here football game and had a lot more space and ran off, and it was a long article, and somebody came up to me and said, I didn't know you knew that many words.
turns out readers sometimes are impatient if you go on for too long. Did you find it difficult, have you found it difficult, Bruce, to organize your material, outline a story with real depth and length, compared to the kind of quick work that you do when you're writing for the newspaper? It's really a big change.
It is, as you know, when you do the books, and you got to do footnotes, notations, and prove to the editor where you got it and that. Correct, you got to be really accurate on your notes and where you got the information. But I had a little bit of a break in newspapers because I covered the courthouse and I covered trials in the legal community for most of my career. And they allowed me to take some in like 5 parts to take a look at some aspect of the justice system. And that kind of gave me a little bit of a start anyway, other than just the daily doing 3 newspaper stories, 2 murders, and some filings in the courthouse, that I could take some time. It wasn't unlimited like a book, but it gave me that opportunity to organize it. And believe me, I remember some of the early ones trying to go back and figure out who gave me that quote, where it came from, and what time. You got to be fairly well organized. And now with the books, you know, I don't do outlines. I mean, I can see them in my head when I started. I know, in doing the nonfiction, a lot of the history books, I know where I want to start and where I want to end up and how I want to structure. My first book, Unlikely Allies on Fort Delaware, I had a big argument with the editor, and the editor won, but it was the last time the editor won on this point. And he just like with a lot of history books, they like to do it in chronological order. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. I'm saying, no, I want to engage that reader in that first chapter. I'm going for the things that's really engaging, and then I can backtrack and do it. But that was the last book I did with that publisher, by the way.
So, which brings up the question, I know a lot of folks aspire to write and to get their material published. Getting published is not easy. How did you start out, and how has that evolved for you, getting your work published?
Well, the newspapers, started off, I actually had an ad. My dad worked at the newspaper, and he was not an editor or a writer, he was a compositor, and they were looking for somebody to cover high school football camps, and they couldn't find anybody. And my dad said, oh, Bruce likes to write. So that's kind of got started there. But with the newspaper, with the books, it is very, very difficult. And essentially, I don't know if it's more difficult. Well, it was more difficult when I started, like 2000s, because there was more traditional publishers, but they were really, really picky. You had to be really good to get it in. But now, if you got a few bucks, anybody can be an author with it self-published and kind of out there. So there's different kind of levels out there with publishing and writing. But the first book that I did with Dale Fesser on Unlikely Allies, I did a lot of research. He did first drafts, I did second drafts, and Dale said, you go find us a publisher. So I got that job. And what I did, I went to the local bookstores and found out which publishers did Civil War history. And I think I had a list of 27, 28 publishers. And I started the pitch letter and sent it out to those. And, it's not like baseball. If we were playing second base and went 1 for 28, we'd be back down in the minors. As with a publisher or writer, you only get one. You only need one. You can only have one. And we were lucky enough we had 3 publishers interested. And when we got that contract, we were very happy and kind of signed it. But we're going to tell authors today, if you're looking for that traditional, you got to remember, it's a business. They got to make money. You can have the best book in the world, the most important book in the world, but if they're going to lose money, they're not going to publish it. You got to keep that in mind. So you do your own marketing and selling to try to get them interested and tell them why the world's going to buy the book.
I always found that, pitching a story idea for a book idea, a little bit like putting the cart before the horse. because they would want to know what the book was going to say.
Right.
Too, and I would tell them, I don't know. I haven't done the work yet. I need you to give me the money so I can go out and do the work. and I was lucky because I had a big success with the book fairly early on. Developed a relationship with the publisher, and over the years I've stayed with him, and we just basically informally kind of work out what I'm going to do next, either his suggestion or something of my own. Now, you mentioned self-publishing. Have you gone that route at all?
Not, I've helped organizations like, I remember I did one with my daughter, was on the history of Calvin Township. There's not a traditional publisher that's going to do a history book, so I could walk them through it and edit it, and I can put together an editor and writer, and I have a publishing house and design firm. So I've helped people, but my books are pretty much outside of maybe one that, and again, along that genre, but everything else has been traditional publishers, because I don't want to have to worry about distribution and books returns, and even though you still have to do a lot of the marketing at my level, the publisher does some, but if you self-publish, you have to do everything yourself, and I want to go do research and work on the next project rather than worrying, who's got the books, on consignment, and how much came back, and the self-publishing.
Yeah. Well, now, I think, Bruce, that you've written about such a wide variety of subjects, but the ones that really people know you for around here are your crime stories. And you can hardly run into anybody. I used to live down in southern Chester County a little further, and everyone you ran into had a story about the Johnston gang. So tell us about how you fell into writing the book about the Johnston gang.
That's actually also a good story, knowing what the publisher actually finally did, but I was covering the courthouse for the daily local news, and I knew the Johnstons from other criminal crimes and trials at the courthouse. And I remember that day, ended up like 3 years of my life. I was driving to Harrisburg for some other story. I heard on WCOJ, the old newspaper, or the radio station here, talking about the shooting of Robert Miller, the death, and the wounding of Bruce Johnson Jr. And of course, I did an immediate U-turn to come back, and from that moment on for about 3 years, that's about all I did. I was out the nights here picking up bodies. I covered both the murder trials, numerous preliminary hearings. It was just every day something was coming up. So I was pretty much right from the murder trials, right at that ground floor. I knew the prosecutors, I knew the various defense attorneys, and I even had 2 hours in the jail cell with Bruce Johnson Sr. As you can imagine, every newspaper reporter, and I don't know, were you there with Julie Cass?
Yes.
Julie Curtis, the great reporter. And of course, we were all asking for that interview, and I was no. And then one day, Bruce Johnson Sr. was being held at Delaware County Prison, and he was forcibly subdued and had broken ribs, and he was pretty well beat up, and later found out that he had some drugs in his cell, and the run and the dog was sniffing it out, and he set fire to his cell and ended up with that. So the next time he came to Chester County Prison to do a hearing, I asked somebody in the courthouse, I said, which way are you taking him out today? Because they were deathly afraid of Johnson's breaking them out and shootouts, so they were taking him out of the courthouse different ways. And I found out where they were taking him out that after his testimony. So he testified, I jumped out first, and they're luckily taking him out High Street. And I stood right in front of him, and I said, Bruce, talk to me now. He said, yes, but just about being beaten up. I said, whatever you want to talk about, it's fine. And I went back and called the warden, and he said, we're shipping out tomorrow if you want to talk to him out tonight. So I went out and spent 2 hours. The first hour, and I don't know what you did, but usually, I'll ask somebody in an interview, can I tape record this one, I want tape recorded. So I put down the tape recorder, turned it on, and I said, Bruce, I'm taking this. And he said, okay. And he also talked about being misunderstood. He was a burglar, he wasn't a murderer, he didn't do this. And, he went on for about an hour like that. And the second hour, I got the alibis, and that's what kind of led to the stories. So that, covering, like I said, the trials and stuff. And I thought immediately afterwards, this is a great book. And I went to publishers, and everybody said, no. There's no heroes in this. Nobody will want to read it. Nobody will want to look at it. And I knew they were wrong. And a couple years after that, the movie At Close Range with Sean Penn and Christopher Walken came out. And actually, I think Julia had something to do with that in some way. I had a dinner with her at La Cocotte that she paid for, and I think it was a little bit from the movie. But they made Bruce Johnson Jr. a lot more sympathetic character than the Sean Penn character. That's how the movie got around it. Then a number of years later, I was sitting in an office with the state police and the FBI. They had retired, and they were private investigators, and I said, your story is much better than the criminals. What you went through and the investigation talked to me. Finally, they talked to me, and that's when it kind of triggered. I got other policemen and some of the gang members at that point talked to me. So that's how I got into covering it, keeping it after, and finally getting the police to talk.
Right. Your story about Bruce Johnson illustrates a basic truth, which I'm sure you've also discovered about reporting, and that is that people want to tell you their stories. Even when it's not necessarily in their best interest to be telling you the story, everyone wants to tell their story. And even someone who is widely regarded as evil doesn't look in the mirror every morning and think, boy, I'm really an evil person. They have their own understanding of themselves, which rationalizes whatever it is that they've done. So it sounds like once you were able to make a personal appeal to Bruce Johnson, and then get a chance to sit down with him, it's like the floodgates open.
Yeah, Bruce, yes. I mean, he wanted to be known as the big tough guy, and so he wanted that notoriety. But also with Bruce Sr., he thought he could fool anyone. And you would just believe anything he said. And the jury convicted him very quickly. It was only like an hour or so.
Right.
And he was, from what I'm told, just devastated that they didn't believe, the jury didn't believe him, that he didn't do it.
Yeah.
So he was there. But also, what I found, some people realize they shouldn't talk, or they're under gag rules, or, in the law, they're just not allowed to tell you stuff. But what I found out, if you don't want to tell me what's going on, you'll tell me what's going on, and there's always that other side of it there. So you just kind of keep after it, you just don't stop. You just
Right. There's always somebody else you can go to.
Right.
And also, have you found that once someone like Bruce Johnson talks to you, others are more inclined then to speak to you as well, because he's done it, so sort of like the dam is broken.
That didn't really happen there, but yes, and what's even better, so when people think you know more than you do, and then they just kind of just throw it out, and then you just kind of nod and say, yeah, keep talking. So yeah, that's kind of it. But I did have Bruce's two brothers, Norman and David, vouch for my credibility once, so that was kind of interesting.
Well, didn't they, in fact, base their appeal trying to overturn their conviction on a story that you wrote?
Yeah, actually, it was in the book. There was a bunch of appeals and stories, and we were talking earlier before we started about hating to be on the witness stand, and I was on the witness stand because one of my stories had information that I probably shouldn't have had, and I invoked the shield laws we had talked about, and the judge said I didn't have to say it. So occasionally that went through it, but after the book came out, they also appealed it. Because there's a photograph in there of one of the other murderers, Leslie Dale, passed out on the bed with a whiskey bottle. And that the Johnsons proved that the prosecution was plying with liquor, and that's he was drunk when he testified against them. What had happened was Dale was not an easy person to get along with, and one day after trial, he just fell asleep in his clothes, and when the policeman put a bottle down, they all thought it was funny and took a photograph, and I got it for the book. So, so they all do that.
I was in Sweden a couple of years ago, about the time that Danilo Cavalcante was hiding out here, there, and everywhere around here. And it's amazing to me what kind of legs that story had. People in Sweden were asking about Danilo Cavalcante in the search. And then I can't tell you the number of times, Bruce, that people have said, "Are you going to write a book about the Danilo Cavalcante thing?" And I would tell them, "No, I think Bruce Mowday will have it." And I was right.
You were right.
So talk about that.
I'm watching it from not that far. I mean, East Coast and Canada. It was fascinating. And you're right. There's people from had relatives in Australia who were calling, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And it got that. And when I talked to somebody in the U.S. Marshal Service for the book, and I ended up talking with like 80 people in the 40 formal interviews, he said what really kicked it off was once the video was released of Cavalcante actually escaping from the prison crowd walking up. And as soon as that was released, that's what it started off, as people could see him coming up and going out.
Yeah.
But, at first, I wasn't really convinced I was going to write a book. Because I'm thinking, who's going to remember this guy 6 months after they captured him?
Right.
So that was kind of my instance. At first, I wasn't going to do it. And then I had 3 communications, email and Facebook messages. And 2 of them said exactly the same thing. Said, you need to write a book because the real story is the community. What happened to the community, how their lives were upended, and how it was changing them. And I thought, that sounds better. It's not just a cops and robbery. Then what really clinched it, a man gave me an email and said, you need to write the book, and you need to talk to my daughter, because my grandson is traumatized every time he hears that helicopter. Because those helicopters up 2 weeks in a row, every day they were up there. And he has post-traumatic stress syndrome, basically what it was. And I said, yeah, that pretty much clinched it. Not only was it the escape and crowd walking, and you had this little guy who kind of stayed around out there for 2 weeks, but also people forgot he was a brutal murderer. What he did to his ex-girlfriend and stabbed her repeatedly, in front of her 2 kids, after fleeing Brazil from shooting supposedly his best friend. It had all those elements there. And I talked with shipping just down the road here in Ackland, and they had come to me a couple years ago to do the 50th anniversary of the murders of the 2 Kennett Square policemen that were murdered just real close to where we were. That book went really well, and they said, write it. So that was the publishing connection, and getting into it, and there was so many layers. You had the search and how they finally found them, and the canine Yoda, and all the technology that was going on. And actually, this was pretty much in the same area a little bit that when Norman Johnson, the Johnson gang, escaped in 1999, so they were kind of in a little bit in the same area. You had a little bit of that. So you had all those elements, but then you had the breakdown in the justice system. Nobody was watching that camera as he was climbing up the walls. And it was a couple hours later that they discovered it. They didn't have enough people. Enough correctional officers found out that they should have had like 4 people watching. And if it was full strength, and only had 1 guard up on the wall, and he was playing video games or doing something with his TV when he escaped. So you had the turmoil. It's pretty much turmoil within the prison system, because when I give a talk on the book, I started first day of the job, and you really want to do great, and you want to make an impression. Well, this guy, the prison work was his first day on this job, and he's got a mass murderer or to escape, and what does that kind of do to him? So you had all that, and the county was not forthcoming on much of anything as I asked some questions. One of them was, how much did it cost? And the response was, we covered all of our costs and didn't cost the taxpayers any extra money. Now, I know the interpretation of that. They paid for the county detectives overtime. They didn't pay the $5.5 million state police overtime. They didn't pay for the helicopters or the airplanes. They didn't pay for any of the other police officers out there, or the Longwood Fire Company had, I think, $70,000 or $80,000 to bill. They didn't pay any of that. And from what various people told me, if you call, add in the cost, the loss of money at Longwood Gardens when they were shut down, it was probably about $20 million for that escape. But they paid for everything. And it's some of the other things they were telling me early on, it was a breakdown just of that prison guard. There was nothing else that caused this, but there was a lot of other things. And Cavalcante was a trained survivalist. Well, he had some experience when he escaped Brazil from when he got out of there, but it didn't go to a camp to learn all this. It was kind of in need. So the county was really defensive. Big story on how everybody found out about Cavalcante. The DA came in that first day, after a couple hours, that everybody in the 3-mile radius was informed that Cavalcante had escaped. Well, you were informed if you had to sign up for the emergency notifications from the county, which very few people were. So there was very few people, and the one incredulous thing that you had this escaped murderer out there, and it was the first week of the school year, and the students were having fire drills and stuff, and somebody from prison called the local elementary school and said, "Don't worry, there's an escaped prisoner, but we're on it." And that was basically the whole conversation, not that he was a murderer, not that they had any action, and this came from the superintendent when I interviewed him. The superintendent said, the parents were calling up and saying, "How dare you endanger our kids' lives? There's a murder around." And he's telling them, "We didn't know. As soon as we knew about it, we shut it down. We kept everybody in." But it was hours and hours before they were really informed. So there's so much there, and it continues that the county was going to do so many different things to help prevent escapes, and they have more cameras. They still can't hire enough prison guards. They didn't even wear prison outfits, because you would have thought somebody would have spotted Cavalcante right when he got out, and somebody actually did see him, they think. But he was in civilian clothes. The prisoners were allowed to wear civilian clothes. There was just so many things that were going on and happening in this book that really enticed me to do that.
I have a couple more questions, and I'd like to open it up for anybody who would like to ask Bruce a question. One of the things about that book that really did impress me was your effort to capture the impact in the community. Because as you said, that was really the most important or the biggest aspect of the story. When Cavalcante escaped, just the sense of panic in the area, which then spread widely, out of proportion probably to what actual threat this guy represented. So tell us, you said you got the idea, that you like that approach. How did you tackle it? What did you decide to do?
Well, a little bit, like you said, when you talk to your editors, I don't know what the book's going to be until I do it. I went in with the idea of the community and the great manhunt, and the police were criticized for taking it long, but when you really look at it, it was hot. It was, they had 70 pounds of equipment trying to go into the underbrush. The canines force was decimated under the new sheriff from what the old sheriff had. So a lot of people said the canines were there early on. They went kind of in the first day. Lots of different things, and like you, I just went in and I started asking, and there was a woman I called the Paul Revere of Toccosin Township, because she was actually informing more people than the county, and she was running the Facebook page, and she was really good. She would not put anything on, she wouldn't put the wild rumors on, so she was really a good person to catch up with first. Matter of fact, the first one she heard was escape, she didn't believe it, but then she got it verified, and it went up. So as this all was coming in, it was obvious with the community, and I found the young mother who lived right next to the prison, and we're pretty sure the Cavalcante right past her as she was watching her newborn, and it just all kind of came together.
So one of the other subjects that you've tackled that's deeply rooted here locally was about Andrew Wyeth and a theft there. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, I actually heard it as a newspaper reporter. And a lot of people, because of how it happened, don't remember it even if you were here. That was in the early 80s, and there was a big burglary at the Wyeth estate and the mill, and there was 15 paintings stolen. And it was members of the Johnson gang. It was after the brothers went to prison for the murders. But a guy named Benny LaCourte, you all might have had your hair cut by Benny down at Burton's barber shop, because he cut hair there for a while. And he was reading the New York Times and saw that one of Andy's paintings went for almost $1 million, and said to Francis Matherly, his cohort, who was a fence of stolen property, said, Andy just lives down the road. I know there's a bunch of his originals there. So they brought up this guy out of Tennessee, a guy named William Porter, who was a master cat burglar and ended up admitting to about 1,200 burglaries. And they broke into the mill, to actually the granary where Bessie Wyeth had her office. And not only did they get one, but they took 15 paintings out of there, and worth millions and millions of dollars, and they couldn't sell them. It was
Yeah, it sounded like stealing a gold watch.
Yeah.
Pretty neat item.
Andy Wyeth said that they were good burglars, but awful aren't thieves. You need somebody to solve. So this whole took on a constant robbers, and then how they got them back is kind of convoluted, and the paintings went to Tennessee. There were derelict cars, you can imagine why the original buried in an abandoned car in Tennessee, and they were trading among themselves. And then Vinny the Meat Man Parrot, there's some great nicknames. Kind of like Joe, this is a cohort, but Vinny started getting them back with the idea he would keep one back, but he would turn the rest in, and maybe get a lesser sentence on the drug and some other charges he was facing. And his friend said, you told him you got to turn them all in. You can't keep one back to sell it later. It's not going to work. So it was this really kind of strange cops and robbers. They had this mountain of riches that they couldn't do anything with. After the book came out, I did a book signed Jamie Wyeth up in Maine. And Jamie was great. He was a great guy, and he told the audience before we started, read the book. It's the greatest. The cops that couldn't shoot straight, and I just kind of loved that whole aspect of it. So, and I remember being at the press conference when they finally got him back, and it was returned, and before they had everybody in custody, Betsy Wyeth wanted to go call President Reagan, and so he could tell the country that they had a great Christmas gift, that all the paintings are back, but they couldn't announce it because the cat burglar Porter hadn't been in custody. Can I tell you something else about Porter?
Absolutely.
I think I'm related to him. My mom's sister is married to a Porter. Marriage didn't last very long, and my cousin cousin Jody Porter. And after I started doing research on the book, I'm thinking, oh, this guy, through the research, this guy was, even though he was coming up from Tennessee, was born in Chester County. And I said, oh, this sounds familiar. So I called cousin Jody and I said, Jody, do you know William Porter? I said, well, I'm not sure, we didn't have much to do with him. But she checked, and a few weeks later she called back and said, I found this one legal document, and it's got a William Porter on it. So it's not 100% sure, but I think there might be some connection with that.
I'm surprised as long as you've been writing stories about where you grew up that you haven't encountered this more often.
Yeah, that's right. Well, actually, my mother would not frowned upon doing family history because she was sure we had a horse thief somewhere.
So, if anyone has any questions for Bruce, please raise your hand, and I will repeat it into the microphone so it will go into the recording.
I have one for you, Bruce.
All right, Karen.
Ralph Lukens, who was the president of the Chester County Historical Society, used to say, if it happens in the nation, you can find a great story about it in Chester County. He liked to say that any major national theme always had a good story, like the Revolution, we've got the Battle of Brandywine. Would you say, all the stories you found, would you go along with that, or do you think he's exaggerating?
Rob Lucas was great, and Karen's question was that, Chester County is fine that every story, in the nation or beyond. I'm not quite sure, but I know when I was a newspaper reporter that it was national, especially the business story, that, that dealt with a certain industry, could go to the industry here and ask, what's your experience in it? And you can tie it in that way. But it's just so much great history here that there's probably something that you can go out. I talked about Gettysburg earlier, and besides my personal connection, Bayard Taylor's brother died on July 2nd at Gettysburg. So there's that really good connection. It's not great, but it's a connection with Gettysburg. Mark?
Yeah, I think Karen's question about whether any issue, national or international, is also reflected locally is true. And sometimes it takes a little imagination to find that local angle. In fact, there's a hilarious headline on one of these National Lampoon newspapers one time where they had as a headline that 500,000, or actually Dayton man and wife killed in blast in Japan. 500,000 other people killed. But it is true. I mean, I think, frankly, Bruce, that I've taught for quite a while, and I've spoken to a lot of young people about journalism and storytelling, and a lot of them feel that they need to have the wherewithal to travel the world, to go to exotic places, because that's where the stories are. And in fact, you're a perfect illustration of how there's a wealth of material and stories right here where you live. And that's true of anywhere, really. It just takes someone with the level of curiosity, the skills, to do the kind of reporting and research necessary, but the stories are there.
They are, and people, reading the newspapers, they want to know what their grandkids did in school, or what's the school district's going to do, raising taxes, or, that local news is so important. That's why I think the newspaper industry is in so much trouble, is they forgot that. And they didn't really stay with their strength. But there's so many great stories here in our area. We're blessed. I never run out with ideas, and people give me hints or ideas for stories all the time.
Yeah. Well, I think what you discover is that it takes work. I used to teach creative writing journalism at UD, and I think probably the most frightening prospect for my students was the blank page. If they have to write 800 words about something, they feel like, what am I going to say? What am I going to do? But the assignment was, go somewhere you've never been. Talk to somebody who you've never spoken to, you otherwise would not meet, interview them, And what happens then is they come back with, they want to know if they can have more space. 800 words is no longer enough because they've actually had experience. They've actually learned something and they have something to write about.
We had reporters that used to love just sitting in the newsroom and make telephone calls, so they never got the best stories. It was always the one out there at the scene and talking. I did want to be a foreign correspondent, but I never did do that. I was starting off, so I never got to do that. But I did cover stories in D.C. that were related to Chester County and through the courthouse. There was one guy that was a drug informant and was known as protection program. Was placed in Richmond and was found dead under very mysterious circumstances. So I got to talk with the U.S. Marshals and had planned to sign a meeting outside of Washington at Tyson's Corner with one of the Marshal Service and spent a couple of days in Richmond going through and talking with them. So, but that's the local connection and also just kind of following the story.
Yes, Mark.
Do you create artificial deadlines for yourself in your writing? Because with the newspaper, you have a real clear deadline. I mean, I was a publicist in New York, and I talked to writers at the New York Times, and they'd say, "I'm on deadline. Can you email me or whatever?" But with any other kind of writing, anything I do, I need to give myself a deadline, and I need to stick to it. It could be ADHD or my part, but I just wonder how you face that.
How we deal with deadlines, how we deal with deadlines. You know, a lot of times publishers are saying, you know, when you sign that book contract, you have a deadline to get that manuscript in and how much. So there's deadlines that way to deal with. You know, some people say that you're really always a good editor to tell you to stop and write and just finish off the story. Because, as Mark was saying, that once you get into it, you want more space and more people, but depending on the publication, you need to stop something at one point and just kind of write and finish it all. So it's always out there. You know, really, the publishers kind of dictate a lot of time. That deadline now for me. It's longer than, you know, get it in by 8 o'clock tonight, but it's so out there.
For me, Mark, my publishers often remark that I'm the only author he has who's always turned in his books on time. And it's because of that newspaper work. And it isn't just because you become accustomed to having to deliver a story at a certain time, but you also get better at estimating the amount of time and effort it's going to take to do something. How much work is this going to take? And if you have if you're good at making that kind of ballpark estimate, it does give you a sort of, it's not a hard and fast deadline, but it gives you a target. And then one of the things that Bruce mentioned earlier was that I, like him, was always eager to get on to the next project. So if I spend 5 years writing a book, by the end of the 4 years, I've got a stack of things that I'm really eager to get to.
So it's like a cookie hanging out there?
Yeah, because if you're driven by curiosity and you come across something where you just feel like, I really want to better understand this, you know, and I know to be able to understand it, I'm going to have to put in the work and I'm going to find the people who were directly involved or go wherever this happened. And all of those act as inducements. I mean, they're like cookies. They're the cookie. I really want to get to that, you know. And so I think that, you know, has been, that functions for me, you know, as a fairly effective deadline.
And you have to read the contracts. I remember one I got and wanted it impossible. I mean, I was a Superman, research the rest. No. It's got me another 6 months on top of that.
Yeah. And you have an incentive too when you're writing a book that's going to take you a length of time. Particularly when I was younger and I had a family to support, I knew that I couldn't just spend forever, you know, working on something. If I had a contract, I had to be able to live off of that contract. And in order to, you can pay your mortgage for only so long on the contract that you've got, and so that kind of gives you a very real world deadline as well. Yes, Elliot.
Bruce, any of your books, while you're researching, while you're doing it, do you see it turning into historical fiction or even fiction? Are you tempted?
No. I really, real people just fascinate me. Why do they do it? And for leisure, I might read a spy novel now or again, but people were so much. I do have one book out there that started out nonfiction and it ended up as fiction, but it's about 70% true. And Mark, you'll enjoy this. You know, now the journalism out there is not great. We don't get all the stories and everything. And I thought at one point, why don't we do that? Why don't I write a book saying that? And I started doing a lot of research on a lot of newspapers across the world. And I got all this great information. I couldn't make it work. It's just, I couldn't think of a way to do it. But I had all this great research. So it turned out into a murder mystery around here. But that's the only one. The real people just really fascinating. And the TV stuff I've been associated with are true crime documentaries rather than the fiction.
Yes.
I would like to ask you, and I wondered this because I did read your book on the Johnston gang. Speaking of that experience, as close as you got to those people who were ruthless criminals, did you personally have any fear? Did you ever feel afraid?
Did I ever feel afraid dealing with the Johnsons? Not really, because one thing about me, I would talk to them and quote them. Not that I believe anything they said, but if they were charged with murder, they should have the opportunity to say, I didn't do it. And some of the other reporters actually didn't. So at least they knew they could talk to me. After the book came out, I was told they were not real happy with the book. And I think the only time I was really intimated to be threatened, it was a drug case involving, I think it was the Tagans. It was one of the motorcycle gangs. I was outside of a preliminary hearing, and two of the guys looked at me and said, looks pretty young. I wonder if he's going to get any older. That was as close as it came, but not really.
When I was working, I wrote a book about Pablo Escobar and the hunt for Pablo Escobar in Colombia. And my next door neighbor said she wanted to put a sign in her yard that said, Mark Bowden does not live here. I have another story along those lines, actually, if I can keep rolling. I wrote a story once about the lawyer, Judith Clark, who represented, among other people, the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. And so I wrote a letter to Ted Kaczynski asking him if I could interview him. And he wrote this hilarious letter back, unintentionally hilarious. This is a man who was in the Supermax in Colorado in solitary confinement. He literally wrote back to me that he was too busy to be interviewed. But the punchline of all this is I get a letter from the Unabomber, and Gail, my wife Gail, says, Mark, you gave our home address to the Unabomber?
And as a reporter, it doesn't mean anything. I used to get calls at home on the phone from drug dealers and stuff. And one was being hunted by the police, and I said, where are you? He said, I'm not talking to that.
I'll tell you what, your question earlier, Elliot, about fiction and nonfiction. I've had this wonderful career writing true stories. And for every book and story that I've written, half of the story, which is not written, is how I got that story. And the stories, I'm sure you could talk all night, Bruce, about the people you've met, the places you've gone, things that you, in your real life, regular life, would never have done for any other reason. And it's just, you could write a whole other book about those things.
You could. I found out that there's, each book has a story on how it got developed or almost didn't make it, and the obstacles in doing it. It's it's so much more than just what's printed.
Yeah. Karen?
Do we have a couple more questions, or we're gonna, I know, I just want to make sure everybody knew that Bruce will be staying after the talk. He'll be out, signing books and everything. Do you want to take a couple more
Sure.
questions?
Yeah. Yes.
As it relates to the Johnston gang, having been a teacher in the Adams Grove School District, oh my God, you understand. And having taught Lane Sampson, and we were very much afraid of the entire environment, and also having my husband be a victim of an armed robbery in Hockessin one night that I witnessed. I was told that if anybody if we said anything, we would be dead. And I was still teaching in Avenue Grove. I'm a wreck right now. And I can tell you that the trauma that those people and people like that have caused, I think, is often unrecognized, just like the PTSD with this other fellow who was running around. And I would like to know why Wayne was actually killed.
Wayne was subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury, along with Wayne Lincoln and Jimmy Johnston. And I talked with the police officers, and when they gave the subpoena, this was after Bruce Johnston Jr. started cooperating after Robin Miller was raped by Bruce Johnston Sr. So the grand jury was in. They three had information because they took part in some of the crimes they were part of the Kitty Gang. And the last thing that the police told Jimmy Johnston was, don't tell Bruce Johnston Sr. your life will be in danger. And he went out and at the Oxford Carnival saw Sr. and said, Dad, I've been subpoenaed, I don't want to testify. And that night the brothers got together and to eliminate the witnesses, they killed all three of the kids and put them in the Haskell estate. So that's absolutely what happened.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation tonight. Just to follow up on these questions, what are your thoughts? What are your feelings on the way the character was portrayed by Sean Penn in the movie?
Yes, a little bit. How was Sean Penn's Bruce Johnston Jr.? Again, that's how Hollywood made somebody likable, this Bruce Johnston. Yeah, the Junior made him a lot more likable. Junior in real life's not that way. He's been in and out of prison so many times for selling drugs and doing everything. When I watched the movie, I said, well, that's true, that's not, that's put together. Then that's the last scene where he captures Christopher Walken. And he takes the gun out of the bathroom cabinet and tells Walken, is this a family gun? Is this a gun you killed my brother with? That never happened. But it's a good scene. So, it's a Hollywood version of it.
Yes.
Do you have favorites of things that you've written?
Favorites.
And why?
It's like, which one of my two daughters are my favorites? I'll tell you, the Johnston book probably looking back, because I wanted to do that for so many years. I knew that it was a book, and I knew the story I wanted to tell. And usually, when I'm not quite sure what Mark does, but when I get an idea for the book, I'm pretty sure I can write it, it's a good one, people want it, but I want a publisher to say yes before you put the time and the effort to really go do it. I wrote the Johnston first, and then I went out to sell it. And I got hooked up with Barricade Publishing out of New York, and I'm so glad I did. And there's a lot of instances, a lot of things going on with Barricade, and I said, look, I don't want an advance. I'll take the money when the book sells. And they said, really? I said, yes. And that led to a great relationship with them. They had never done a Civil War book before they did my Pick Charge. They were in New York City. I talked them into doing a book on Richie Ashburn. She, the publisher, asked her friends up there, and they said, yeah, that's all in Philadelphia. So it was a really, really good relationship. But yeah, the Johnston book probably was the one.
wrap it up, I think.
Okay,
Is
all right.
that, let's give our